Hello, we are live. My name is Nate Fischler. I am an Asia Pacific analyst with Rain. I am here with Matthew Orr, our Eurasia analyst. Hi, Matthew. How are you?
Thanks, Nate. It's great to be here. How are you
Um,
doing yourself?
Doing pretty good. So we're here to discuss sort of an update on the Russia-Ukraine war. Let's just jump right into it. So we expect a counteroffensive to be coming up. Can you tell us a little bit, Matt, uh, state of preparations of Ukraine's counteroffensive, and what are your expectations as to
Yeah,
what happen?
yeah. I mean, the shorter answer is that the preparations for the counteroffensive are definitely continuing. The Ukrainians are still trying to stockpile equipment and move their formations to the front for the offensive. There's kind of there's a lot of reasons why the offensive hasn't come yet. One of the biggest being that just weather hasn't really permitted. It's been actually one of the wettest late springs in the Zaporizhia region in a while, and there's actually been flooding in certain places. That's definitely not what you need if you're going to conduct a counteroffensive, or not what you would want to see, particularly because the first 24 to 48 hours of this are always critical in any operation like this. The Ukrainians want to gain as much ground as possible, and for that, they would like to have the ground as dry as possible. But of course, it's a double edged sword because every day that goes by, the Russians are also continuing their own preparations and building fortifications and trenches and laying mines. The mines are really the key one that make it so much harder for the Ukrainians to advance without taking larger casualties. But I mean, I still tend to think that the Ukrainian counteroffensive needs to come sooner rather than later. There is kind of some thinking, going on amongst analysts about whether maybe it's better that the Ukrainians are sitting back. They're keeping the Russians kind of on their toes, but on the other hand, they're still accumulating military equipment from the West. Of course, that waiting is also a risky strategy because that also allows the Russians to keep preparing and doing the things I just mentioned, which might allow the Ukrainians to squander this unique time where the Russians haven't declared another new round of formal mobilization measures since last September. And their volunteer campaign is maybe going a little bit better than last summer, but still not yielding tons of new manpower for the front. So in general, I mean, I still think that the Ukrainians have a decent chance to make breakthroughs at multiple locations along the front. I tend to think that the most important place for them to move forward is in the south towards the Sea of Azov, and so I tend to think that that's really where the main thrust of the offensive should be. It could come in another place. I think the second most likely place would be the central Donbass region, kind of more around Bakhmut, potentially kind of in the Donetsk, greater Donetsk area. And then, of course, there's the possibility of attacks up in the northern Luhansk region, which is also quite likely. But I tend to not think that would be the best place for the Ukrainians to focus their counteroffensive. But in general, look, it's preparing. There's still a lot of Ukrainian forces still preparing in NATO countries, actually. The bulk of those have prepared, but some of them are still in Germany, for example, training on the U.S. Abrams tanks. It doesn't seem like those units are actually going to take part in the counteroffensive. But in any case, the Ukrainians are preparing, and it looks like that even as the initial counteroffensive starts, they're still going to have new forces come in to continue.
All right, that's very thorough. You touched on a lot of very interesting threads there. First of all, so the weather. Are you suggesting that had there been more optimal weather conditions, this counteroffensive may have begun already?
Yeah, I mean, I look. I think it's one of many factors. I think it's definitely one that the Ukrainians are and everybody is looking at a lot. As I said, I'm kind of skeptical of this idea that the Ukrainians waiting around is actually is necessarily very good for them. So I tended to think it should have happened sooner. But if you told any military that they can't advance because of mud, or that they can't do anything because of mud, that's almost a way to like insult them. And so I don't think that the weather is like necessarily the biggest issue here. I think the much more likely reason is that they didn't have the weapons to do so. Specifically, we didn't even get these announcements of these Storm Shadow longer range missiles that increased the Ukrainian strike range until just a couple of weeks ago. So I mean, every day we're still getting new pieces of information about new systems reaching the front. And I think that, right, those things are the more likely overarching explanation for what the Ukrainians are looking for, is making sure key systems like that are really stockpiled.
Interesting. Okay, that's a good point. There's been a lot of chatter too about the counteroffensive potentially involving an attempt to retake Crimea. What do you think about that likelihood? Are they going to try, first of all? And if they do, what are the chances of success?
Yeah. I mean, look, unfortunately, I don't think the Ukrainians are necessarily in a position to retake Crimea this year or even anytime soon. The reason for that is just because it's going to be so tough for them to break through in southern Ukraine. And then even if that all goes very smoothly, and even if they, for example, use the Storm Shadow missiles to destroy the Crimea bridge, the Kerch Strait bridge that links Crimea to Russia, and of course, they would have already severed the land bridge, and Crimea would be this isolated, vulnerable, essentially island that can be blockaded. It would still be very hard for the Ukrainians to kind of quickly militarily swoop in and seize the island or anything like that with an amphibious operation for which they don't have the boats or the aircraft or landing craft or other things like that. So I don't really think that that's feasible. But in, I guess you could say, a best case scenario, they do actually seize up to Crimea and begin blockading Crimea. And that's right. That's a very, I think, dangerous scenario for Russian President Vladimir Putin, because now, not only are the Ukrainians taking back the strategic prize for the whole invasion, i.e. the access to the Dnieper River and the so-called Crimea land bridge, but now they're actually, right, threatening this place that Russia claims to have annexed, almost a decade ago. And so that would, come with all kinds of consequences for him politically. And I think that this hints at some of the kind of the broader things that I wanted to actually ask you about, which is that, right, this is a quarter where we could see a lot of escalation, right? It's hard to imagine how the Russians are going to react to an environment if they're losing ground on the battlefield, and the kind of the political justifications for the war becoming more and more and more tenuous. It's also going to prompt Russia to do things on kind of that have international ramifications, things like potentially leave the Black Sea grain deal. I mean, it's hard, for example, to imagine them staying in the deal if the Ukrainians are on the doorstep to Crimea. So, I mean, I tend to think that the possibility of the Russians leaving that deal will definitely be the highest ever at this coming renewal session. And as you know, I've always been very bearish on this idea of Russia leaving the deal, which has been correct. But now I think is there's all kinds of reasons why this is the time when it would make most sense for them to do so. And so, I mean, I guess the question for you is, I mean, are people in the region you cover, APAC, are they, how are the countries in the region, are they preparing for a prolonged war? Are they preparing for these more escalatory scenarios and their consequences where Russia could leave the grain deal, things like that?
Sure. I mean, well, Asia Pacific's a vast region. All the countries there have separate interests, of course. You could touch on maybe three of them. Of course, China has sent Li Hui, special envoy, for the Ukraine conflict. He's visited, I believe, Moscow, Kiev, and several EU countries. China's role here, they're trying to mediate. They're trying to boost their own diplomatic profile as a credible peacemaker. It's not going so well, but that is the effort they're trying to make here. It's my belief that China would like this conflict to wind down, but they're not really willing to put much pressure on Russia to that end. They're putting more pressure on Kiev to that end. So I don't expect a ton of progress there, but they are trying. They'll probably intensify their efforts in that direction too. More interestingly, maybe, and more relevant to the counteroffensive, is the United States is pushing very hard for its Asian allies to make contributions to Ukrainian stockpiles. So they're trying to get the South Koreans, for example, to send artillery shells to Ukraine, or to the U.S. first, and then the U.S. will transfer them to Ukraine. This is still a blurry issue because it seems like the Korean president, Yoon, wants to do this, but there are some legal constraints, some political constraints that make it difficult. So if it does happen, it could be under some sort of shady secretive circumstances. And then they're also pushing Japan to provide for Ukraine stockpiles. Similar issue, Japan's constitution forbids the export of items that have an exclusive lethal purpose. So they're trying to work around that. The U.S. wants TNT from Japan so that they can put the TNT in artillery shells to then send on to Ukraine. So it depends, which country in Asia you're asking about. U.S. allies are increasingly, nervous about Russia and wanting to help the Ukraine war effort, but face a lot of constraints, and they're not really involved in European geopolitics, never have been. So it would be a historical sort of change to get involved, inching in that direction. And I do think that, to another part of your question, I do think most countries, nobody knows when this will end. So they are preparing for a protracted, long-term conflict and what that will mean for their individual national interests.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And it's somewhat, I guess, reassuring is not the right word, but I think potentially it makes sense to hear that, because I think that the kind of a protracted conflict is at this point the most likely scenario. But I didn't know if there were some holdouts that, some countries still tend to think that a peace deal might be struck, and that, global commodity prices might fall as a result, and that would, help their state finances and lead to all these, positive benefits for them, or that they were banking on things like that happening. But some of them potentially also benefit from this, where, right, the general high commodity price environment that we've seen also, depending on the resource, also has certain benefits for these countries involved. And I mean, I think that's really, one of the key implications that, I continue to kind of point to, is that, right, this kind of high price environment, it's not going to go all the way away, and the Ukraine war is going to continue to contribute to that. And that's again related to the grain deal. I know that one of the big reasons that Russia even stayed in the deal was that, they didn't want to fuel food inflation in countries that it really wanted to bring into its geopolitical orbit. And so I think that potentially a risk to flag, and that our clients and listeners should be aware of, is that, there remains this possibility that potentially as soon as the next quarter, a whole gaggle of factors could come together to really re-aggravate that food price issue once again. And that always has, certain stability effects in all over the world.
Sure. Yeah. Global food and energy prices are definitely a concern for everybody, and Asia Pacific countries are no exception to that, for sure.
Yeah. Are Asia Pacific countries concerned about, I mean, because the whole problem in Europe, or in NATO, I should say at this point, is that they're concerned about, we're doing so much to supply Ukraine, including these things like artillery shells, where, right, the reason that NATO is turning to South Korea and Japan is that the concern is that their own stocks needed for a potential great power war, for example, with Russia, are too depleted. And so that's why they're searching for these other suppliers. I mean, how is this idea playing in places like South Korea and Japan? Are there these similar domestic concerns about, oh my gosh, well, if we, start supplying them, we might not have our own stocks for some sort of contingency in our own backyard? Or what are the general kind of issues that are resonating in regards to these growing weapons deliveries from the region to Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. Well, to my knowledge, there haven't been, weapons deliveries. The intention is to try to get them going. I think I've heard less chatter about the concern that this will deplete their own stockpiles. It's more about the changing precedent for these two countries, South Korea and Japan, who are not activist, outward looking. Japan has a pacifist constitution. It is legally forbidden from using war as a means to settle international disputes. So it's less about their own stockpiles and what they have on hand, it's less about that. It's more about the political implications, the geopolitical implications, what it means for these two countries to emerge as sort of global geopolitical players in a region that is nowhere near them, and they have not historically been involved, and have thought that concerning themselves, sticking their nose in Europe, isn't much their business. So there's a bit of a concern on, I guess, I don't know, putting the global spotlight on them like this. And they have their legal requirements. Neither of them want, their legal codes specify that they don't want anything that they make to be used on a battlefield to kill soldiers of a third country. So it's those sort of worries that this could be a sort of transformative moment for both of them in terms of their geopolitical engagement with the broader world and not just the Asia Pacific region. Some people don't want to be involved in that sort of thing because it can lead to trouble. So that's mostly what the debate is about at this moment in time. If shipments start heading out, then we might see more of a stockpile worry.
Right. Well, yeah, it's definitely going to be something to look out for going forward. And luckily, it's an issue that we've been covering. Through in our own analysis, we had a piece essentially related to this about South Korea recently. And so with that, I guess we can wrap up this discussion. And I would encourage you to go read more of our work on this at rain.com or rainnetwork.com, excuse me. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you back in a week.
Thank you, everybody.